Calejon, look, there's something at stake in this campaign, in this election, that wasn't present in any of the previous ones. Because in the previous campaign, you had the debate about democracy, about the risk that Bolsonarism represented. By the way, Bolsonaro is in jail for the attempted coup d'etat and everything else. A broad front was formed in defense of democracy. But at no time in 2022 was there any foreign interference of a colonialist or imperialist nature in Brazil and in the Brazilian electoral process. What is happening now was unthinkable. Actually, because this second Trump administration marks a shift in global geopolitics, where the United States moves from soft power and multilateralism to a more open imperialism with clear colonial ambitions, especially in Latin America. This is even included in the defense doctrine, the national security strategy of the State Department, published by the United States at the end of last year. It states this explicitly. It's the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. That's the subtitle of the section where they talk about Latin America, where they say, look, Latin America has wealth, Latin America has lithium, Latin America has copper, Latin America has oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. That's why Trump intervened there. Latin America has rare earths, Latin America has graphite, Latin America has quartz, and an important part of these reserves are in Brazil, especially rare earths, which is the second largest in the world, only behind China, is quartz, which produces silicon. It's the base of silicon. And I don't even need to mention it because of Silicon Valley, which is an essential component for the digital economy, for electronic technology. Brazil has the largest reserve of quartz in the world and also of graphite. So look, what's happening now is that the United States wants to recolonize Latin America, and Brazil is part of that. 500 years later, and what's the logic? The logic is very similar to the backside of the Legion. The Spaniards, the Portuguese came here to our continent, took our gold, took our silver for centuries, enslaved our people for centuries. After the 20th century, first the English, then the North Americans took our iron ore. Since it's the basis of steel, it was essential for the industrial economy, right? Steel was a key component for the world's industrial economy. Brazil has one of the largest iron ore reserves in the world. So what's the idea? We export the raw iron ore and they add value abroad with the steel industry by making steel. And that's how it is to this day. Brazil produces little steel and is a major exporter, the fourth largest in the world of raw iron ore. That's the reality. And they want to do the same with rare earths. So the operation that Trump is building, that the United States is building, is a direct operation to interfere in this election. And that shows what's at stake. What's at stake is not Lula against Flávio Bolsonaro. It won't be just that. It won't even be just two different projects for the country.
Okay, Boulos, doesn't it seem like it's not working very well for Flávio's candidacy? It got a lot worse, especially after the audio of him calling Vorcaro, who's at the center of the biggest corruption scandal in the country, his big buddy, saying he'd always be with the guy. Then came Tari Flávio, and all of this really wears down Flávio's campaign. The latest polls have been showing Lula significantly ahead. That doesn't mean it's a sure thing that everything is decided, but President Lula now appears to be in a, let's say, more comfortable position in which, by all indications, he should be re-elected. I talked here on the channel, Demori and I, we talked with Mauricio Mora from Instituto Idea. And I asked him openly if he believes in a first-round victory. And he told me, look, not only do I believe it, but today I would say there's a good probability of that happening. How do you see that, Boulos? Do you believe in a first-round victory? And given the current context we're in, with this very aggressive interference, I'd like you to talk a bit about the importance of a victory with a capital V, right? Preferably in the first round, but if it goes to the second round, that it be as broad as possible. And also an important victory in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, Boulos.
João, you don't win an election ahead of time, right? I think we're going to have a very tough contest, okay? But a tough contest, right? It's not exactly contradictory to the possibility of the election being decided in the first round, because you could have such a strong polarization, even with all of Flávio Bolsonaro's weaknesses. What has support on the Brazilian right is Bolsonarism, and that's what will channel it, which is kind of absurd, right? A citizen like this having 40 something percent is a symptom of the difficulties we have. And what about the advance of this far right fascist and backward logic that has gained ground not only in Brazil but in several other places? What do you think, man? What's the plan for Brazil under Flávio Bolsonaro? Have you ever stopped to think about that? I mean, what does he propose for Brazil's public health system, for family farming, for public education? He has no ideas, right? He's an empty candidate who's only riding on his last name. Yeah, that's what he has. What could they do? What approaches could they take, like the right has done historically, and go down the path of fighting corruption? Look, what's Flávio Bolsonaro's authority to talk about corruption? You mentioned Bolgaro's audio, but yes, let's say that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have the 6 million mansion here in Brasilia. We have 51 properties bought with cash. We have the Rachadinha scheme. We have money laundering. In other words, it's a long criminal record. He could talk about public security, and he's trying to do that, saying, hey, he wants to fight crime. His history of connections with the militia in Rio de Janeiro. How is he going to fight crime? Look, he has a lot of weaknesses, right? But undeniably, he's the main opposition candidate.
This interference, do you believe big tech should be used? Do you believe it? Because, man, I want to believe it, okay? That we won't experience an armed US military invasion on Brazilian soil. And that would be the biggest scandal in the history of the West, possibly, right? I don't think that's going to happen. Now, again, Boulos, everyone I've talked to, PhDs in international relations, people who followed this their whole lives, the most experienced reporters, I would ask them, do you think he's going to base our entire export rate on account of a guy who was involved in a coup, was tried, convicted, and imprisoned? And he had every right guaranteed by our legal system. And these experts would tell me, no, that's not going to happen. And it happened. I would ask, do you think they're going to invade Venezuela to kidnap the country's leadership? No, that's not going to happen. But it did. So at this point, Trump is a shady guy. He's reckless. He's a person with absolutely no ability to perform the job he was elected for. It's hard to even know what's going to happen next. But first, I'll start there so we can rule out that possibility. I don't think you believe in a US military invasion in Brazil either. I want to start by hearing your thoughts on that. But beyond that, in what other ways do you think what we're already seeing, what Millie is doing and so on, but what other forms will this interference take in our domestic affairs, Boulos? So, Boulos?
Thank you. I think it's very unlikely, right? Any kind of military action. Brazil is among the 10 largest economies in the world. Brazil is the regional power of the global south. So it's a bit different, right, from other cases. In the case of Venezuela, there was a 20-year process of attrition and delegitimization. There was even a self-proclaimed president, the United States recognizing him in the middle of all that. So you already had a situation that, let's say, made an intervention to kidnap Maduro in Venezuela more plausible, though no less absurd, right? That's what they did. Just like they assassinated the former leader Lula, Ayatollah Khamenei, in Iran. In other words, now I think it's important for us to put things in their proper place. Because I think this Tarifaço offensive and what Trump has done against Brazil doesn't seem to me to be because of Bolsonaro, you know? Because Trump probably even has a certain disdain for Bolsonaro. Yeah, nobody respects Chassa. Nobody respects the lapdog. Trump uses him. But I think what's at stake is that he didn't get to impose what he wanted in the negotiation process with Brazil. That's the main issue. Because look, first he attacked And that's part of his strategy. He attacks trying to force a retreat. Lula didn't back down. Lula held his head high, but at the same time, he opened a dialogue with him. That was the famous chemistry. But the chemistry had an expiration date, because when the real negotiations between Brazil and the United States began, the United States set conditions that were intolerable. They wanted control. They wanted to export rare earths in raw form without refining or processing them here in Brazil. Adding value over there in the United States, they wanted to reproduce a colonial logic with Brazil, imposing conditions for not charging tariffs that were unacceptable. It's the same thing. I see some people, some journalists, even political analysts in suits on TV networks saying, but Lula didn't know how to negotiate. He didn't want to, echoing that discourse. It's such an impressive thing. Because you see, just imagine you're going to negotiate with someone. Then the person goes there and says, I want your car, I want your house, and give me the password to your bank account. If you don't do this, I'm going to tax you. In other words, anyone with a shred of dignity is not going to accept a situation like that. Then they'll say, you didn't know how to negotiate because you rejected this deal. And that's what we see, a kind of inferiority complex that still exists in the field of national opinion making, which is impressive. I mean, Lula opened up to negotiate. He sought negotiation on fair terms, but sovereignty was not on the table. I think that's the main issue. How can they act? As for your question, I think there are ways. One of them is more than obvious, the big tech companies. Just like they acted in other presidential elections, this is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy theory. There are very well documented and proven cases of how the biggest big techs in the world are American, right? Meta, which controls Lula and Facebook, Google, which controls YouTube, and also the Google search engine itself. That is, this gives tremendous power in shaping public opinion, in influencing, informing people's awareness, political and electoral choices. Calejon. So yes, we have to be monitoring this very closely. So we have to be monitoring intervention of this nature, interference of this kind. Besides that, what they tried with those two officials who correctly, our government, President Lula, decided to revoke their visas. They were coming here to raise questions about the electronic voting machines. This keeps building up, building up. Since they see Lula as the favorite, they also need to build narratives to try to delegitimize the process, to try to isolate Brazil, to make us more vulnerable, and try to impose the negotiation terms they want for their own interests, right? So this worries us. Of course it worries us. And these are not just, let's say, hypothetical possibilities. They're real possibilities because this has happened in other Latin American countries.
Perfect. Boulos, to wrap up here, my friend, I want to thank you. We have more than 4,500 devices connected to this conversation with you right now. I have to ask you about the end of the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule, which is in the Senate. It's going into recess now and the vote will happen in August, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's important that we don't let this topic cool down. It's an extremely important issue for the Brazilian working classes. And in this confusion, this electoral confusion we're living through, this issue might end up being set aside for a while.